bored with that. Okay, now that we have the recording started and it's just a minute or two after the appointed time, I'm not going to say exactly the time because I'll get it in the wrong time zone. Oh, what the heck. It's 1600 and something UTC. I'm just assuming that I'm going to launch into this unless one of my colleagues tells me otherwise. This is a webinar on the subject of governing the ungovernable. And notice that ungovernable is, of course, in quotes or inverted commas, depending on which version of English you speak. One giant leap for the RSS in 2021. Now, let's see. There we go. Everything's working now. In terms of my own background, for those of you who haven't had the chance to meet me yet, I am a lawyer by profession. I am general counsel to ISC. I have spent, for better or for worse, the entirety of my 30-odd years in law focusing on how the law applies to information tech and communications technologies, including how it applies to various use and iteration and rollout of the internet. I've spent more than 20 years teaching legal and regulatory aspects of cybersecurity, and I was very closely involved in assisting with the production of some of the documents that we'll be talking about later in this session. The big caveat, of course, on this screen, which is my comments are personal. They do not necessarily represent the opinion of ISC or any root server operator or anyone else that I can think of. My family, my friends. I mean, I'm out here on my own. This is just my opinion. So what I want to cover in this webinar is I want to take you through a very brief, and I mean very brief, history of the root server system as told by a lawyer. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time on a recent and possibly continuing sovereign state effort to regulate the root server system. Specifically, I'll be talking about the draft NIS Directive. But the bulk of our time will then be spent talking about a significant breakthrough on the subject of root server system governance. And I'll explain a bit more about how that happened and what it all means for the future of root. So, a brief history of the root server system as told by a lawyer quickly. Once upon a time in 1984, John Postel and Paul Macapetris set up the first root server, and then within a year there were 3 more. So what I'm going to show you here is just sort of a snapshot at different points in time taken from a document of history of the root server system that will give you an idea of what was going on and who was involved. So this was the snapshot in 1985. Then by 1991, this is a red letter day for me because it was when I first sent and received an internet email and I thought it was magic. I still do sometimes. We were up to a total of 6 root servers and 6 RSOs, and these were their names and those were their IP addresses and the other were the organizations who ran them. In 1994, a little organization called ISC entered the frame, running the what is now froot, and by 1995 there were a total of 9 root servers operated by 9 root server operators, and in 1995 we saw the renaming to the root-servers.net convention that we all know and love today. Now that enabled in 1997 the addition of 4 additional root letters, J, K, L, and M, and by the end of that year, K-root had been bestowed upon RIPE in the European Union, and M-root had moved to WIDE in Japan. 1998, ICANN was founded. Wow, ICANN was founded 14 years after the root server system began, and LRoot was transitioned to ICANN. In 2000, big change in the marketplace. VeriSign acquires NSI, and by acquiring NSI, they ended up acquiring ARoot and JRoot, and in the same year, iRoot moved over to NetNode. And in 2002, finally, Cogent acquires PSINet, a company that I used to be very familiar with when I started in this profession. And with it, they acquired the operation of CRoot, and that, folks, has pretty much been the picture for 20 years. That was really the last time that a root server operator has changed hands or changed control or anything else has happened. So that's your picture. Now, in 2002, we started seeing there were some changes to the environment, of course, that were also significant. I've just picked a couple out of the air. One is that in 2002, FRoot began to anycast internationally. Then, very significantly, 2014 to 2016, the IANA function starts its transition from the US government to ICANN. So, as of January 2022, and I'm 99% confident that this is all still accurate as of today in March 2022, here's your list of root servers, root server operators, and their corresponding IPv4 and IPv6 IP addresses. In summary, as of today, we have 12 operators, 12 root server operators, who make use of 13 root letter addresses. Traffic queries sent to those resolve to, as I looked at it yesterday, 1,525 root server instances around the world, more of which are being added all the time, and these include Anycast instances. They are located or instantiated in what looks like more than 100 sovereign states, and guess what? They operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365.25 days a year, without interruption, for the purpose of publishing the root zone globally at no charge to the people who want to look up information from the root zone. So with that little bit of history out of the way in terms of where did the root server operators come from and when did they get there, we turn our attention now to our second topic, and that is NIS2, the NIS2 directive. And I've labeled this the accidental, maybe, RSS killer, possibly, or maybe not. A little bit of uncertainty involved in terms of what NIS2 means to the root server system right now. But here's where we are. First of all, what is it? Many of you will probably already know what NIS2 is. Just as a refresher, the first NIS directive, now known as NIS1, basically a directive that said to member states of the European Union, it would be really nice if you could get your skates on, pull your socks up your game, raise the bar, whichever silly metaphor you want to employ. Get a little bit better with defense of your critical national infrastructure. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff in there about, European cooperation and policing and investigation, but for our purposes, the main thing that it said was, everybody, hey, let's start looking after critical national infrastructure in the European Union, please. Quickly, it kind of emerged that most people were a bit dissatisfied with it, and they said, we need a bit more regulation, or we need to push the market a bit harder, hence NIS2. So the European Commission comes forward with a draft in late 2020, makes sure that DNS services all up and down the chain are included, and here's the significant part where it gets scary if you're a root server operator. The Commission draft specifically targets root server operators, specifically targets root server operators as a subject of regulation. There's a small business exception, but it doesn't apply to people like root server operators. Now, why do I care about that? ISC is a small to medium-sized enterprise in a European Union regulatory context. We have fewer than 50 staff. We're very stable. We've got a great operating model, but even so, we can't take advantage under this draft. We would not be treated with the small business exception because root server operator. So the question is, why was this, or maybe why is this, remains to be seen, a problem for root server operators? And that has to do with the geographic scope of the regulation. The Commission draft would mandate the regulation of everyone, no matter where they are, who provides root server services, however we need to define those, to people in the European Union. And all of you involved in this space will know better than I do that queries to the root zone, queries to the root server system come from all over the place, and they're addressed all over the place. So because the RSS is a globally unified system, we have a system where people who are in the EU will address queries to root servers that are geolocated inside and outside the European Union. And people in the EU will be querying root servers that are operated by all 12 of the RSOs. And when you start looking at this from a regulatory perspective, and what many of us have spent time trying to educate the European regulators about, and many of them do appreciate this, as you'll see, is that the process of regulating root server operators, it's almost impossible to draft a regulation to regulate just one of them without regulating all of them. It's a bit like drafting a regulation to just regulate one wheel on a bicycle. It's not going to work. You have to either get them all in, or you're not really addressing whatever problem you think you're fixing, and there isn't really a problem that needs to be fixed, in my opinion. Now, the problem from our perspective as a root server operator, and for all of our colleagues who are RSOs as well, is what I call the slippery slope of national regulation. And that is, if this directive says, and under the old Commission draft, this directive would have said, that multiple EU member states can each regulate root server operators, then the question becomes, well, if it's good enough for EU member states, what about other sovereign states around the world, numbers 28 through 192. And once that floodgate starts to open, the concern that we have, obviously, is that regulatory interventions from multiple sovereign states could result in an untenable situation where we have problems of conflicting standards or problems of conflicting reporting requirements. State A says you must report within 72 hours. State B says you're not allowed to report because we're still investigating. Then what do? This is not a situation that any multinational enterprise wants to get caught in, and it could, and we think would, fracture the root server system. And that's what we've said. Anything like this would create huge artificial pressure to fracture operation of the root server system along borderlines. And besides, we keep saying, isn't this the sort of problem that the multi-stakeholder model exists to resolve? I mean, haven't we had this argument before? Don't we already have a solution for that particular problem? And why aren't we facing in that direction? So there is some evidence that perhaps this effort to cover all of the root server operators was not necessarily what some people in the European Commission intended. And that's because some of their earlier reports in support of this early draft, they continually talk about the two root server operators who are based in the European Union, RIPE and NetNod. But they didn't seem to appreciate that the regulation of necessity would reach all 12. Now, the European Parliament, once they got a hold of this, took a really interesting view of this, and the rapporteur from the European Parliament issued an amazingly strong, very, very good report, and it included this comment. Root name servers should be out of scope. Why? Because regulating them is contrary to the EU's own view about what the internet should look like. So why we should get them out of this particular law. So the relevant committee in the European Parliament looked at that report and adopted it by an overwhelming vote, 70-3. And the parliamentary redraft, so the redraft of this NIS2 that's come out of the European Parliament, has not just deleted the reference to root servers, they went out of their way to insert language that says, and by the way, root servers are definitely not included in this regulation, which is, in our opinion, a great result. Now, sadly, there is some evidence to suggest that the European Council, the other half of the European regulatory coin, because you have to get the European Parliament and the European Council to both agree the terms of a directive. There is some evidence to suggest that the European Council wasn't completely convinced by that, and there was some effort apparently to try to get some, but not all, of the root server operators back into the mix. But as people keep saying to the European Council and others, how can you possibly lay out regulatory requirements for just a couple of these without reaching them all? And no matter how you draft this, you're going to end up reaching into an extraterritorial regulation situation. And this isn't about data protection. Data protection is about human rights and the protection of living human beings in the European Union, so we understand why you did it there. This is about critical infrastructure. And that's a very different story. And here we're talking about a type of regulation that could fracture the internet. So we're hoping that that has overcome the council's slight hesitation about, isn't there a way that we can keep the root servers in? We think that root servers will stay out of this particular law, but it's not over until it's over. And this year we see what we call the trilogue discussion process commencing, where the European Parliament and the European Council, with help from their friends at the European Commission, all try to agree the terms of one big happy new law, and we're keeping an eye on it. So, that's NIS 2. That's NIS 2 done. Now I'm going to talk about root server system governance. And this is the more highly focused stuff. Anyway, I'll tell you all about it. Here we have the root server system governance challenge. Let's begin with this. What problem are people actually trying to solve? Well, the problem that some people defined is that there is no governance structure for the root server system. The root server operators are in a very unusual position in terms of internet infrastructure. We exist independently of the ICANN governance process. There is a body that the root servers are able to contribute to which advises the ICANN board, but there is no governance mechanism on how the root server system operates. And there is no internal governance structure that talks about how the root server operators deal with each other. Or is there? We'll get back to this. So, going through what I call one small step, and I realized after I first did this presentation that one small step really doesn't give it justice. I just wanted to use one small step so I could end with one giant leap. But this was also a very big step. And that is in the period 2015 to 2018, the root server operators collectively realized that we really need to do something a bit more formal about root server system governance. So they carried out a series of workshops over those period of 3 years that eventually resulted in the adoption and publication of RSAC 037, a proposed governance model for the DNS root server system. It's only 50 pages long. Only 50 pages. In my world, that's not that big a deal. It's a very good document. It's worth a read. It's very focused on a lot of things. And also RSAC 038, which were 3 recommendations specifically addressed to the ICANN board about what to do with 037. And I should add, they were all very polite recommendations. Oh, by the way, RSAC. This is the thing I mentioned to you before. For those of you who don't play what I like to call ICANN bingo, RSAC is the Root Server System Advisory Committee. It's where each of the 12 root server operators has a designated representative and a designated alternate, and also people from other members of the ICANN committee come as observers, and people feeding information in and taking information out. It's the usual kind of ICANN talking shop where people can, on a structured basis, share information and create publications. Well, RSAC, as a body, publishes documents of interest to the root server system stakeholders, which are most of the world, really, especially telecommunications operators and access providers, and also to provide advice to the board, RSAC. You'll be hearing me say this a lot. So in response to these recommendations from RSAC, the ICANN board did a couple of things. They held some hearings and asked for some input from the global internet community, and then after that period, they then chartered a working group, the Root Server System Governance Working Group, the RSS GWG. Here's a hint, GWG is another phrase I'm going to be using a lot. So this governance working group was then given the task. The board said to the governance working group, what we want you to do is to propose a model root server system governance structure that takes account of RSAC 037 and RSAC 042 and a bunch of other things. So we want you to propose a way to embody, to instantiate these principles that have been sent over to us by RSAC and RSAC 037. RSS GWG spends the latter part of 2019 getting its stuff together, getting people appointed. They commence their work program in January of 2020, which proceeds in the way that a work program normally does. And they then produce not sort of a final model, a final output, but they say, maybe we better check in and see where we are. And in early 2021, they came out with what I think is described as a draft model for a governance structure. And the RSOs read that draft model very closely. And as I've said on this slide, that's when things started to get really interesting and really fast. Why was that? Well, because with the best will in the world, RSS GWG was working very hard to try to figure out how to push the governance discussion forward. Having said that, the draft model that they came up with didn't really seem to adhere very closely. In fact, seemed to diverge quite a ways away from RSAC 037, and this caused what I've described in this slide as unrest among the people in the RSO community. And the question that came up is, well, how can we, the RSO community, structure a productive conversation on this? And I've listed 3 options here on the slide. Option 1 is the most fun. It lets everyone just shout at each other for days at a time. It's fun, but it's not really, I wouldn't call it productive. Option 2 is what I call the trial and error method. Well, if you don't like that governance structure, what about this one? Or what about that one? Or what about the other one? Or what about something else? We have some on the shelf. Why don't you just look at those and, pick from this menu? Well, that possibility shone a spotlight on a bit of a problem. And that is, how would we, if we were presented as a community with a series of different governance models, how would we know the difference between a good one and a bad one? I mean, sure, we have RSAC 037 that has a series of principles, but in terms of embodying the principles, what would we use to evaluate proposals? And that's where we started looking at that. Let's create a framework to analyze these proposals. And that is what led to, last year, the adoption and publication of RSAC 058, which is the success criteria for the RSS governance structure, and an accompanying recommendation, 059, addressed to the ICANN board, recommending how to put that into workflow. Now, I want to stress, because people keep telling me I'm a little bit newer to governance discussions and ICANNology than some others, but this entire process of let's talk about how to provide feedback to GWG, and then resulting in a unanimous adoption by all 12 RSOs of RSAC 058, a 21-page document with a whole series of success criteria, was done in about 7 calendar months. And that's because it was a pretty hot topic of discussion. I've said here, by my estimate, there were at least 22 hours of meetings and workshops over 15 sessions, some of them longer than others. Very good attendance from all sorts of people, the RSOs, liaisons, ICANN staff, all sorts of folks crawling all over this process and contributing ideas. Done and dusted in 7 calendar months. Why was that possible? Answer, because it turns out the RSOs were very closely aligned in terms of what they thought they were trying to accomplish. So it really became an exercise, a problem-solving exercise of let's get out on a piece of paper the sorts of things that we're looking for and the sorts of things that we think are critical to the successful future operation of the root server system. So that publication happened in November 2021. The ICANN board, within days of publication, had a special board meeting in which they said, yay, great going. We love 058, we like 059, and transmitted those documents over to GWG with what I'm calling a positive endorsement and a guidance note. You can actually look up the letter that they sent if you know where to look for these things. The thing about ICANN is that everything is published so long as you know where to look. It's actually a very interesting organization to look at from the outside looking in. And before I tell you any more about steps, let me now focus on, okay, so what do the success criteria say? How do they work? What do they say? And what does that mean for the future governance of the root server system? The first thing that the success criteria document does is to acknowledge what I'm calling a current reality. Remember earlier I said there's a question to be posed. Is there an RSS governance structure today? Well, if you want to find the answer to that, you really need to first draw a contrast between a technical standard and a governance structure. A technical standard is something that describes what technical systems do, whereas a governance structure describes what people are supposed to do. The goal of a governance structure is to influence the behavior of people. Okay, so do we have something that accomplishes that? The answer is yes, it's governance, Jim, but not as we know it. And as the RSOs talked about this subject in rather a lot of detail, there was a dawning realization that, yeah, we actually do have a governance structure. It's just very informal, but it works. So let's figure out, what do we mean by that? And what do we mean by it works, and what do we mean about the structure? Well, RSAC 058 makes this statement very early in the document. And it says that the root server operators have been very successful as a governance structure because you can look at 3 conditions and 3 indicia of success. And yes, we're going to be making these slides available afterwards. Certainly will. If we weren't planning to do that, we certainly will now. While the root server operators have been, what are the conditions? Acting collectively, acting collaboratively, and remaining individually independent. What have they done with those operating conditions? They have defined the core principles that govern how root services should operate. They have delivered the root service in accordance with those principles, and they have served to maintain trust and integrity of the service. In other words, from the early days of DNS, before ICANN was ever in existence, the root server operators have collectively taken on an operational and a collective governance role in delivering the root service. And they have assured a stable single internet by defending those core principles against anyone who threatens them. Therefore, if we start with that history of governance success, we now look to a governance future. And it is our opinion as a group that the continuing status of root server operators as autonomous and independent entities with a significant voice, undefined, in governance remains an important principle for the success of the governance structure. Now, why is that undefined? Answer: because it's too soon to try to define it. That's something that needs to be defined. It's the principle that we were trying to capture. So what's the process of getting us to a new governance structure? Okay. If we start and think of these various steps, from my perspective, I'm a bit new to the process. So for me, I think of the beginning point as the success criteria. The success criteria, of course, don't exist in a vacuum. They merely reflect a very long, decades-long process of development of principles, development of ideas, development of structures, development of ideology, all those things. But nonetheless, the success criteria is probably the best document that we have at the moment that wraps up in a single place what is it we need in a governance structure. Now that leads to, in the words of RSAC 058, suggests that what we need to now produce is an RSS GS functional description. A functional description of how a governance structure should look, or in GWG language, what they call the final model. We then move to the next step, which is we take that functional description and we translate it into a series of constitutional documents. Maybe those will be contracts or a memoranda of understanding or a letter of intent or a shareholder agreement. I have absolutely no idea, and no one's trying to prejudge what that will look like, except that I suspect a lot of lawyers will figure it out in due course. But they need to know what their target is, and the functional description is what gives them their target. Once the constitutional documents are done, we have effectively final agreement, or a signature phase, Will it be a ceremony? I don't know. Who knows? It might be very informal. It might be very formal. But it's only when we reach that final agreement on the constitutional documents that we start the transition to the new governance structure. In other words, the deal needs to be done before people shift into the new mode. So if you look at the success criteria document, and by now I'm sure many of you have already downloaded it and are looking at that rather than listening to me, and that's fine, I don't mind at all, you'll see that it's divided into 3 categories of criteria. The substantive criteria in Part A, the Part B transition process criteria, and the Part C clear statement criteria. The vast majority of the criteria are in Part A, substantive criteria. And that's the sort of thing that you would expect. Things like, we need to have operational independence, and there needs to be transparency and accountability, and there needs to be a finance mechanism, all those kinds of things. The principles of RSAC 037 and RSAC 055 must be respected, all those kinds of things, substantive criteria. Transition process criteria are things like, hey, in the process of moving to a new governance structure, remember to keep the root alive. Please keep the root server still working. Don't interrupt. Make sure that everything still functions. That's your number one job. And other things. And the clear statement criteria basically boil down to a don't hold off for tomorrow decisions that you can make today. So there's always a bit of, let's delay making a decision about this important issue to some future date. Well, the Section C criteria say, look, there's just some things that must be decided at the level of the functional description. You can't leave that to a future decision maker to decide. That now is the time to make these decisions. So when you're looking at these success criteria, particularly the Section A criteria, you need to realize that they describe principles or ideals that are in tension with one another. So what that means is that, first of all, fulfilling almost all of these criteria, they're not highly prescriptive. They're almost all principles-based, particularly Section A are almost all principles-based, which means that you can't just look at them and say, fulfilled, yes/no. It's not a binary output. The success, have you met it or not, is not sort of a tick box exercise. It's an evaluation exercise. And so it's possible for a proposed governance structure to be stronger on some of these criteria and weaker on some others, which means that you have to achieve some kind of a balance between them. And they're in tension with one another. So we will find out how this goes out as we sit down and start the process of discussing these. So here's a couple of highlights for you. Obviously I'm not going to go through all the success criteria. That's for you to do. Please read it and enjoy. Or just read it and don't enjoy, whatever. If you have to read it, I'm so sorry for you if you don't want to, if you don't like these sorts of things. But they're there. A couple of things I want to bring to your attention. Criteria A.1.1.1 says that the governance structure must include provision for cyber incident oversight and disclosure obligations and codify security threat and vulnerability information sharing. There's a very strong desire within the community of root server operators to find a way to formalize the process of sharing security threat and vulnerability information. We'd like to find a way to collect that up into a reporting body. And then in future, if we continue to face requests or even demands from external parties or other members of the ICANN community to talk about security issues, we'd like to collect that together into an authority, some type of a authority or mechanism that will help to reflect those out. In A.3, which talks about the so-called financial function, which is referenced in RSAC 037, there's a couple of interesting ones. A.3.4.3 is something that we put in there that says we want to preserve the status of the root server system as a public good, which is to say we want to make sure that it will be made available for no charge at point of use, which is how it's done today. We don't want to be in the micropayments business. A.3.5 stands for the proposition that whatever governance body we're about to create needs to operate on a not-for-profit basis. It should be something obvious beyond question, but sometimes it's the things that are obvious beyond question that you want to write down and make sure that nobody misunderstands. And also in A.3 we find A.3.7 that says that while the governance system must provide opportunities to finance root server operators, because here's the challenge with running a root server operator. You don't do it for money, you do it for love. because it costs money and it doesn't earn revenue. It is a significant part of the internet infrastructure of today that is not financed by the things that finance every other part of the internet, core internet sort of standards making and governance process. But A37 stands for the proposition that whatever the governance structure is, it needs to provide opportunities to financially support root server operations, but it may not impose an obligation to accept sources of funding. And that's because we anticipate that some root server operators might exist in a constitutional status where they're not allowed or they have no desire to accept such funding from this type of a structure. If we look at some of the transition process criteria, B1, you'll see this, that parties who will be governed by a new governance structure must have appropriate and enforceable assurance that the governance structure is fully implemented in constitutional documents prior to transition. In other words, we need to know what the checks and balances are before the new structure moves into force. And this was drawn from a concern about the draft model that GWG had come forward with, which is there seemed to be an awful lot of, oh, well, those are issues that will be solved by some super regulator downstream. Well, no, we need to figure this out now before we jump into a new structure. B2, operational stability during transition. I mentioned this earlier, which is no matter what else you do, you got to keep the root server lights on. Everything's got to continue to function. You cannot allow the transition to become a risk to good functioning. We've been functioning continuously without interruption for more than 3 decades. It'd be a shame if trying to make a better governance structure was the thing that actually destabilized the roots. So this is an important criteria. Again, should be obvious, but obvious things are worth stating. So in terms of what happened next, and I'm just about done here. I'm just about done with the slides, so none of you have to panic too much. And that is, the root server system governance working group received its letter from the ICANN board in late November. So on the 2nd of December, they accepted RSAC 058 and 059 into their work plan. They asked, could RSOs please give us some suggestions on how GWG should change its composition, its operation, its rules of engagement, its charter. RSOs made suggestions to GWG on that. So then in January, GWG transmitted a letter to the ICANN board where they said, hey, dear ICANN board, would you please amend our charter to make 2 significant changes? Change number 1, invite all 12 RSOs to the table, the GWG table, so that we can discuss this with all of them. And change number 2, amend our decision-making procedures, because up until now, we've been operating with a charter that says that we decide by consensus if possible, but if we think we can't reach consensus, we can decide on a majority vote. Change that, please, to consensus only. After that, the ICANN board gave a positive response to the GWG. It took a few weeks for that reply correspondence to reach them, and they said, yeah, okay, that sounds good to us. In the meantime, while we're working on that, please start engaging with the RSOs as soon as possible, pending documentation of the charter changes. And the ICANN board and RSAC met jointly, as they always do, at ICANN meetings. So at ICANN 73, there was a very positive, mutually supportive joint session where the main subject of discussion was the breakthrough in the governance process. Lots of love in both directions, bouquets being thrown at everybody. I mean, we're very grateful for the support from the ICANN board. ICANN board is very grateful for the support of the RSOs and the RSAC. Everyone's aligned. Everyone's moving in the direction towards better tomorrow. And in the meantime, a lot of stuff is going on in preparation for what happens next. And that is, some of the governance working group constituencies are in the process of appointing replacement representatives. Why? Well, they've been chartered now for a little more than 2 years, and some of the people who were appointed was told it was a 2-year gig. And some of them have said, I've sort of reached the end point of how many of these meetings I can attend, and it's time to refresh the membership. And so a number of those constituencies are refreshing who their representatives are, A number of people are retiring from GWG. That includes the current chair of GWG. The RSOs are selecting their representatives who will join the GWG, and it's on target to restart its workflow in April of this year. And there's just some preliminary unofficial chitter-chatter in the background about precisely what that first session will look like. And there's a lot more interesting stuff yet to come. So with that, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will be very happy to answer any questions to the extent that you got them. If you don't have questions, you can just make one up.